Picture this. You're 8 years old, and the king personally decides who you'll marry in 10 years. Refuse, and your family loses everything they own, possibly even their heads. Welcome to childhood at the court of Henry VIII. In the golden halls of Hampton Court, where tourists today admire tapestries and carved ceilings, 500 years ago, dramas unfolded that would make modern parents clutch their hearts. The king who made history with 6 wives and countless executions left a particularly dark mark on the lives of his palace's most defenseless inhabitants, children. This isn't just another story about a bloodthirsty tyrant from history textbooks. This is a conversation about a system where childhood was a luxury only peasants could afford. At the Tudor court, children became pawns in a grand political game from the moment they took their first steps. And the nobler the family, the sooner a child lost the right to their own life. Why does this topic matter today? Because we live in an era when children's rights seem unshakable. We're outraged by child marriages in distant countries. We fight to protect children from exploitation. We create international conventions. But do we understand where the idea of childhood as a protected period of life came from? And how fragile civilization's achievements can be? The story of Henry VIII and the children of his court is about how adults' political ambitions turn little people into instruments of power. In the 16th century, this was normal. Royal and aristocratic children weren't born for happiness, but to serve their dynasty. Their future was determined not by abilities or desires, but by political advantage. Henry V's court was an especially cruel place for children, precisely because the king constantly changed the rules of the game. Today you're the king's favorite. Tomorrow, you're a traitor's son. Today your family is in favor. Tomorrow, they're under the executioner's axe. And children paid for decisions made by adults in chambers they weren't allowed to enter. Take the hostage system that Henry perfected. Noble families were obligated to send their children to court, supposedly for education. In reality, this was a guarantee of loyalty. Try rebelling against the king when your son or daughter is in his hands. Children became living collateral for their parents' obedience. But the most terrifying thing wasn't even the physical violence that was commonplace. More frightening was the psychological pressure under which these little people grew up. They understood their lives didn't belong to them. Any day could be their last, not because of illness or accident, but because of political intrigue in which they were merely pieces on a board. Researchers debate the exact number of children who suffered from Henry VIII's policies. But archival documents speak for themselves. Letters from parents begging not to be separated from their children, records of forced betrothals of 8-year-old girls, bills for funerals of young Tower prisoners. Behind every line lies human tragedy. The practice of royal pardons looked especially cynical. Henry could execute a family's father for treason, then mercifully take his children under his care. Sounds noble? In reality, this meant children fell completely dependent on the person who killed their parent. Imagine the psychological state of a child who must thank their father's murderer for care. The king's contemporaries, even his supporters, sometimes were horrified by what was happening. Thomas More, future saint of the Catholic Church, wrote about children at court as tender plants growing in poisonous soil. The Venetian ambassador reported to the Doge, "The king treats noble children like property, considering neither their feelings nor parental tears." This system worked because there was no alternative. A family that refused to send a child to court was automatically declared unreliable. And in Henry VIII's era, suspicion of disloyalty often equaled a death sentence. Parents faced a terrible choice: give their child to the king's clutches or put the entire family at risk. And children understood this. In their letters that survive today, we're struck by their unchildlike seriousness and understanding of political realities. 10-year-old boys wrote to parents about the necessity of maintaining loyalty to the king at any cost. 12-year-old girls discussed prospects for advantageous marriage, like business partners. An 8-year-old girl receives a letter from the king with a marriage proposal from his 40-year-old friend. Refusal is impossible. It's treason against the state. Welcome to the world of dynastic marriages in the Tudor era, where children were living currency for political deals. Henry VIII turned children's destinies into a chess game where every move was calculated decades ahead. The king personally compiled lists of potential brides and grooms among his subjects' children, starting from age 5. His notes and report margins survive in archives. Reserve this girl for the Duke of Suffolk. Send the boy to Scotland for betrothal to the princess. The system worked simply and cruelly. Noble families had to provide the king with complete information about their children: age, health, appearance, character. Based on this data, Henry made decisions about future marriages without asking the opinion of either children or their parents. Refusal was considered disobedience to the crown and punished by property confiscation, sometimes even execution. Take the story of Elizabeth Scragg, daughter of a wealthy Yorkshire landowner. In 1532, when the girl turned 7, the king decided to marry her to his 60-year-old treasurer, Lord Fitzwalter. The reason was simple. The Scragg family owned strategically important lands in northern England, and Fitzwalter needed an heir to pass on his title. The girl's father tried to object, citing his daughter's young age. The king's response was brief. The betrothal will take place immediately. The wedding, as soon as the girl turns 12. When Scragg continued protesting, he was accused of disrespecting the royal will and imprisoned in the Tower. Elizabeth was betrothed by royal decree and spent her first wedding night at age 12 with a man 5 times her age. The fate of the most famous victim of this system, the king's daughter Mary Tudor, shows that even royal children weren't protected from paternal tyranny. Mary was betrothed 7 times during her life, starting at age 2. Her first fiancé was French Dauphin Francis. A political alliance with France required dynastic reinforcement in the form of a child betrothal. When Mary turned 6, her father broke the engagement with the French prince and betrothed his daughter to Emperor Charles V, who was 16 years older than her. 2 years later, the political situation changed again, and 9-year-old Mary was promised to the French king. Each change of fiancé meant not only a change in political course, but psychological trauma for a child who didn't understand why her future changed on adults' whims. The practice of investment betrothals was particularly cynical. The king married minor daughters of his subjects to wealthy but childless aristocrats in exchange for financial injections into the royal treasury. If the groom died before the wedding, the girl became a widow, without having been married, but with rights to part of the deceased husband's inheritance. This money naturally went to the crown's disposal. Documents show that Henry personally controlled betrothed children's physical development. His letters survive, demanding regular medical examinations of minor brides and detailed reports on their health. In one letter from 1535, the king writes, "Lady Anne is too thin for her 10 years. Increase her rations and monitor her menstrual cycles. The wedding must not be delayed due to the bride's poor health." The psychological impact of such a system on children was devastating. Modern studies of children's letters from that era show high levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts among minor victims of dynastic marriages. 12-year-old Catherine Howard, Henry's future 5th wife, wrote to a friend, "I pray every night for God to take me before the wedding. Better to die a child than live as someone's toy." The hostage system complemented the practice of forced marriages. Noble families' children were kept at court supposedly for education, but actually were living guarantees of parental loyalty. Any attempt to disobey the royal will immediately affected the fate of child hostages. The Percy family's story illustrates this practice with frightening clarity. When the Earl of Northumberland expressed disagreement with Henry's church reforms, the king immediately demanded that all the earl's children aged 5 to 15 be sent to court. Formally, this was an invitation to receive court education. In reality, taking hostages. The earl's youngest son, 8-year-old Thomas, was placed in a room next to the royal chambers and was effectively under house arrest. His letters home were censored, meetings with parents strictly controlled. When the earl tried to take his son home, he was told the boy was receiving too important an education to interrupt it for parental whims. Children quickly understood their role as living hostages and learned to use this position to protect their families. Letters survive where 10-year-old boys and girls warn parents of danger. "The king questioned me at length yesterday about your dinner conversations. I advise father not to support the Duke of Norfolk. At court, they say he's fallen from favor." The fate of executed traitors' children was especially cruel. After Thomas More's beheading, his minor grandchildren were transferred under the care of royal servants and effectively turned into servants. The executed Earl of Essex's daughter became a maid to one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, though by birth she had rights to an earl's title. Henry used children even in religious persecution. After the break with Rome, Catholic families' children were forced to publicly renounce papist errors. Refusal meant accusation of heresy with the prospect of burning. 10-year-old boys and girls were forced to stand before courtiers and renounce their father's faith to save their lives. A teacher raises a rod over 8-year-old Prince Edward, future King of England. The boy can't solve a Latin problem, so he'll receive 20 strikes on his bare buttocks. If this was the fate of the heir to the throne, imagine what happened to ordinary children at Henry VIII's court. The physical punishment system in the Tudor palace was so cruel that even contemporaries, accustomed to harsh education methods, sometimes were horrified. The king personally approved regulations for corporal punishment of children of all classes housed under royal roofs. The document, known as Discipline Rules for Young Persons, survives in archives and reads like a sadist's instruction manual. For light offenses, being late to lessons, incorrect bowing, unlearned lessons, 5 to 10 rod strikes to the palms were prescribed. For medium violations, talking during service, dirty clothes, losing school supplies, 10 to 20 strikes to the back. For grave crimes, disobeying teachers, escape attempts, insolent speech, 20 to 50 whip lashes on bare flesh. But most terrifying, punishments were assigned not only for specific offenses, but also for prevention. Every Monday, all children at court received educational beatings, 3 to 7 rod strikes to remind them of the need for obedience. The king believed regular physical punishment built character and fostered devotion to the crown. The story of Prince Edward, Henry's only legitimate son, shows that even royal blood didn't protect from paternal cruelty. The boy began his education at age 4 under Dr. Richard Cox, known for his harsh methods. Cox kept a detailed diary of the prince's punishments, which survives to this day. Entry from February 15th, 1543. Prince Edward, 6 years old, could not translate a phrase from Cicero. Punishment, 15 rod strikes to the buttocks. The boy cried but didn't beg for mercy, a good sign for a future king. Entry from March 3rd of the same year. Prince was late to Greek lesson by 15 minutes. Punishment, 10 strikes to the palms. Hands swollen, cannot write. Writing lesson cancelled. Public beatings were particularly cynical. Punishments conducted in the presence of other children for edification. Every Friday in Hampton Court's Great Hall, all children at court gathered to watch the execution of offending comrades. The king sometimes personally attended these sessions, commenting on punishment technique. A letter from the French ambassador from 1539 survives. Yesterday I witnessed a horrible spectacle. The King of England watching a 12-year-old boy being flogged for dropping a wine cup. The child lost consciousness after the 30th strike, but the beating continued. His Majesty was satisfied and remarked that English children must be stronger than French ones. Punishment instruments were specially made for the children's court. Rods were made from young birch twigs no thicker than a finger to cause maximum pain without causing injury. Whips were braided from thin leather straps with knots at the ends. For the smallest children, soft rods from willow branches were used, which left bruises but didn't cut skin. A special category of punishments was designed for girls. They weren't flogged on bare flesh. This was considered indecent, but more sophisticated methods were applied. Girls were forced to kneel on wooden blocks for several hours, while holding heavy books above their heads. For serious offenses, girls were locked in dark closets without food or water for 1 to 3 days. Psychological punishments were no less cruel. Children were forced to publicly repent for offenses they didn't commit. They were compelled to inform on each other, with promises of rewards for vigilance. The most terrible punishment was the threat of being sent home. Children knew this meant disgrace for the entire family and the end of any life prospects. Palace physicians' medical records show a horrifying statistics of injuries among children. On average, every child at court received serious bodily harm from punishments at least once a month. Broken ribs from beatings, dislocated arms from hanging by wrists, burns from heated rods. All this was considered normal consequences of proper upbringing. Dr. John Chambers, the king's personal physician, left records of treating children's injuries. Little Lord James Harrington, 8 years old, brought with 2 broken ribs after punishment for disrespecting his teacher. The boy cannot breathe normally, but asks not to tell his parents about the injury. He fears his father will consider him weak. In another entry, Lady Margaret Douglas, 10 years old, severe bruises on back and legs. Punished for trying to protect her younger brother from beating. The girl shows signs of deep psychological disorder, doesn't speak, doesn't eat, constantly trembles. But most disgusting, the king took pleasure in children's suffering. His letters survive with detailed descriptions of punishments and admiration for some children's endurance. In a letter to Lord Hertford from 1541, Henry writes, "Yesterday observed the beating of the Earl of Wiltshire's son. The boy received 40 strikes for insolence, but didn't make a sound. Such children will grow into true warriors for England." The physical punishment system served not only educational purposes, but political ones. Noble families' children who suffered cruel punishments at court returned home broken and intimidated. They became conduits of royal will in their families, living reminders of what awaited the disobedient. Comparison with modern standards of child treatment shows the full depth of humanity's fall in the Tudor palace. What was then considered normal upbringing would today be classified as especially grave crimes against children. Each of Prince Edward's educators would receive life imprisonment in a modern court for systematic child abuse. 10-year-old Mary Fitzgerald stands before the palace chapel altar and publicly renounces her ancestors' Catholic faith. Tears flow down her cheeks, but she speaks words about papal errors. Otherwise, her younger brother will be burned as a heretic. Henry VIII's religious terror turned children into victims of adults' wars over faith. After the break with Rome in 1534, the king launched a massive campaign to eradicate Catholicism among English nobility. Children became the primary target of these repressions. Henry understood it was easier to break religious consciousness at a young age than to re-educate adults. A hunt for young papists began that claimed hundreds of children's lives. The system worked simply and mercilessly. Every week at the palace, faith checks were conducted among noble families' children. Children as young as 6 were forced to answer questions about the king's supremacy over the church, condemn the pope's authority, acknowledge the legitimacy of Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Wrong answers or the slightest hesitation were recorded in a special register of suspected heretics. A protocol from one such check on November 23, 1535, survives. 7-year-old Edmund Campion, son of a Catholic baron, when asked about the king's supremacy over the church, answered, "My father says the Pope in Rome is supreme." A week later, the boy was accused of heresy and sentenced to public penance. If he had refused, he would have faced the stake. The practice of forcing children to inform on their own parents was particularly cynical. Court spies convinced children that true devotion to the king is above family ties. Children were taught to eavesdrop on parents' conversations, remember phrases about the old faith, report secret prayers and fasts. For each denunciation, a child received encouragement, sweets, toys, new clothes. The Mortimer family's story shows how extreme this system became. Lord Mortimer, a secret Catholic, prayed every evening before a hidden crucifix in his chambers. His 8-year-old son, Robert, educated at court, learned of this during a home visit and reported it to royal agents. A month later, Lord Mortimer was arrested on heresy charges and executed. The boy was rewarded with the title Faithful Servant of the Crown and monetary support. Children from Catholic families were subjected to special forms of psychological pressure. They were forced to attend executions of heretics, so they could see what fate awaited the disobedient. 10-year-old boys and girls stood in the front rows when Catholic priests were led to the stake and had to shout approving exclamations. Refusing to participate in this spectacle was considered a sign of heretical views. Thomas Cranmer's diary survives, where the Archbishop of Canterbury describes one such case. Today, priest John Fox was burned. 32 children from suspicious families attended the execution. Young Elizabeth Reynolds refused to shout, "Death to the heretic!" and cried when the fire blazed. The girl should be subjected to additional re-education. Purification rites were particularly cruel. Public ceremonies where Catholic parents' children had to renounce papal errors. These spectacles were held in London's main churches before large crowds. A child stood on a platform before the altar and read a renunciation text composed by royal theologians. A typical renunciation text sounded like this: "I, an unworthy servant of God, acknowledge my errors in faith and renounce the power of the Roman Antichrist over the Christian Church. I recognize as the only head of the Church on earth our merciful sovereign, King Henry VIII. I ask forgiveness from His Majesty for my sins and promise henceforth to serve the true faith." After this, the child had to kiss the royal ring and publicly curse the Pope. Children who refused to participate in such ceremonies were declared unrepentant heretics. A special fate awaited them: imprisonment in the Tower's special children's block, where minor religious criminals were held. Conditions there were horrifying even by 16th century standards: damp cells without heating, meager food, complete isolation from the outside world. In the Tower's children's block during Henry's reign, at least 200 children aged 6 to 15 were imprisoned. Most never saw freedom. They died from disease, hunger, and cruel treatment. Mortality among minor prisoners reached 80% per year. The few who survived left prison as broken people, incapable of normal life. The fate of executed Catholic martyrs' children was especially tragic. After Thomas More's beheading, his grandchildren were declared infected with heresy by blood and subjected to forced re-education. They were forced to daily curse their grandfather's memory, call him a traitor and heretic. 2 of the children couldn't withstand the psychological pressure and committed suicide by throwing themselves from the palace tower. The king personally controlled the religious purification process of children. He regularly received reports on young Catholics' re-education progress, made margin notes, gave instructions about tightening or easing pressure measures. In one such report from 1537, we read, "Girl Anne Clement still refuses to acknowledge the king as head of the church. Recommend depriving her of food for 3 days and showing her torture instruments." The most steadfast young Catholics were subjected to physical torture, officially forbidden for children, but secretly applied in the Tower's basements. 12-year-old Richard Gwynne was stretched on the rack for refusing to reveal a secret Catholic priest's whereabouts. 13-year-old Margaret Clitheroe was subjected to water torture. The bound girl was lowered into a water barrel until unconscious. Henry's religious terror created an entire generation of traumatized children who lived their whole lives afraid to speak about their beliefs. Many later became fanatical Protestants, not from conviction, but from fear. Others retreated into deep silence, becoming living ghosts of their own childhood. Still others went insane from constant tension and fear. Hollywood films show us Henry VIII as a charismatic tyrant surrounded by a luxurious court of brilliant aristocrats. But what if I told you that half the historical facts about childhood in his palace are myths created centuries later? It's time to separate truth from legends and understand what really happened to children at the Tudor court. Myth 1. All children at court were aristocrats. Popular culture created an image of a palace populated exclusively by noble families' children receiving aristocratic education. Reality was much darker. Archival documents show that of approximately 800 children permanently at court, only about 150 belonged to noble families. The rest were children of servants, craftsmen, merchants, and even peasants. These children came to the palace not for education, but as cheap labor. 6-year-old boys worked in kitchens, carried water, cleaned stables. 7- and 8-year-old girls served as maids to noble ladies, washed laundry, mopped floors. No literacy training or court etiquette instruction was provided for them, only heavy physical labor, 14 to 16 hours a day. Historian David Starkey, who studied palace archives, calculated that mortality among servant children was 3 times higher than among noble children. Causes included malnutrition, disease, workplace accidents, and cruel treatment. The average service duration for a child of common origin at court was 2 years. After that, they either died or became unfit for work due to injuries. Myth 2. The king protected children as the nation's future. This beautiful myth is especially popular in British historiography. Henry is portrayed as a caring ruler who saw children as England's future and tried to give them the best upbringing. Documentary evidence says the opposite. The king viewed children exclusively as instruments for achieving his goals. Henry's surviving decrees contain demands to send children of stronger body to the palace, not out of concern for their health, but for more effective use as labor. In a letter to the Lord Lieutenant of Yorkshire from 1536, the king writes directly, "We don't need weak and sickly children. Select those who will live at court for at least 5 years and bring benefit." The practice of probationary periods for children was particularly cynical. Newly arrived children were subjected to especially harsh trials for the first 3 months, forced to work without rest, given minimal food, subjected to cruel punishments for the slightest offenses. Survivors were enrolled in the palace staff. Those who couldn't cope were sent home due to illness, or buried in nameless graves in the palace cemetery. Myth 3. Physical punishment was normal for that time. This argument is often used to justify Tudor-era cruelty. Supposedly everyone beat children in the 16th century, so Henry wasn't exceptional. Comparative document analysis shows that even by his era's standards, the royal palace punishment system was exceptionally cruel. Venetian ambassador Marino Cavalli wrote to the Doge in 1540, "In France and Germany, children are also punished with rods, but what I saw in the English palace exceeds all understanding. Here children are flogged not for correction, but for intimidation. This isn't education, but systematic terrorization." Comparison with other European courts shows the unique cruelty of the English system. At the French court, corporal punishment of noble children was strictly regulated and couldn't exceed 5 rod strikes. At the Spanish court, children weren't subjected to physical punishment at all. It was considered degrading to future aristocrats' dignity. Only at Henry's court was beating elevated to the rank of pedagogical system. Myth 4. Children received excellent education. Popular films and books created an image of the Tudor court as a center of learning where children studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, and music. For the vast majority of children, this was an unattainable luxury. Real education was received only by royal family children and the most noble aristocrats, no more than 20 to 30 people at once. Other noble families' children received only basic skills: ability to read and write in English, arithmetic basics, dancing, and etiquette. But even this education was subordinated to the main goal, making children into obedient servants of royal power. Textbooks of the time consisted mainly of texts about the divine origin of royal power and subjects' duties. The content of the primer for young nobles, published by Henry's order in 1537, is revealing. The first phrase is children learn to read. The king is God's representative on earth. Disobedience to the king is mortal sin. A faithful subject is ready to die for the sovereign. No fairy tales, poems, or entertaining stories. Only political propaganda for toddlers. The real picture, a system of total control. Freed from myths, we see the true nature of Henry VIII's children's court. This was a system of total control over the English elite's rising generation. The king understood, to ensure absolute power in the future, children's will must be broken today. Every aspect of a child's life at court was subordinated to this goal: daily schedule, food, clothes, entertainment, communication. Everything was controlled and regulated. Children were taught not to think independently, but to obey orders without question. Any manifestation of individuality was cruelly suppressed. The informant system was particularly telling. Children weren't just encouraged to report comrades' offenses. This became a mandatory condition for court survival. A child who didn't inform on a violator was considered an accomplice and punished equally. This created an atmosphere of universal distrust and fear where no one could be sure of tomorrow. The psychological consequences of such upbringing were catastrophic. The generation that grew up at Henry's court was distinguished by extreme cruelty, suspicion, and inability to empathize. These same people later conducted religious persecution under Mary Tudor and organized mass executions under Elizabeth I. Numbers. That shock. Modern researchers, processing palace archives, reached horrifying conclusions. During Henry's 38-year reign, about 12,000 children passed through his palaces. Of these, fewer than 4,000 lived to adulthood. The rest died from disease, accidents, were executed, or disappeared without trace. The average age of death for a child at court was 11 years. Main causes: dysentery, 30%, workplace accidents, 25%, complications from physical punishment, 20%, murders, 15%, suicides, 10%. These figures show the true face of English history's golden age. Behind the glitter of palace festivities and political triumphs lay thousands of children's tragedies, silenced by official historiography. Understanding this truth is important not only for historical justice, but for protecting children today. The power mechanisms Henry VIII used haven't disappeared. They've merely taken new forms. Learning to recognize signs of systematic violence against children in the past, we can better protect them in the present.